Okay, this is going to be part two of the reading here. And we left off where the Lusitania sank. 1,201 people lost their lives in the sinking of the Lusitania. And this is supposed to be used as a false flag to get Americans angry enough to push for a war, or to push to join the war against Germany. And so we'll continue with the reading. This sinking has been described by Colin Simpson, the author of a book entitled The Lusitania, as the foulest act of willful murder ever committed on the seas. But the event was not enough to enable President Wilson to declare war against the German government, and the conspirators changed tactics. They would use other means to get the American people involved in the war, as the flame of indignation did not sweep the United States as had been planned. Robert Lansing, the Assistant Secretary of State, is on record stating, "We must educate the public gradually. Draw it along to the point where it will be willing to go into the war." And, you know, this brings a point up to me of people that say, well, you're just a conspiracy theorist. You have no proof. The proof is in their own documentation. Even before the war happened, they were plotting to gain the public support for the war. They already explained their motives: money. They already showed complicity, and then they concealed it. So in their own records, their own ledgers, their own meeting minutes, on record, these people are committing murder for profit, so that they can make war and then make money off of that war. So, I mean, it's right here. You know, this is just one of the earlier examples of it in the last 100 years. Anyway, after the sinking of Lusitania, two inquiries were held, one by the English government in June 1915 and one by the American government in 1918. Mr. Simpson has written that both sets of archives contain meager information, kind of like the 9/11 Commission, and there are substantial differences of fact in the two sets of papers, and in many cases it is difficult to accept that the files relate to the same vessel. Isn't that something? So you've got two conflicting reports with very little information, but they come to the same conclusion based off of very little evidence given. And in both inquiries, the conclusions were the same. Torpedoes and not exploding ammunition sank the Lusitania, because there was no ammunition on board. The cover-up was now official. So they publicly said there was no ammunition on board, but however, ledgers, J.B. Morgan's own ledgers, show that the manifest had ammunition on board. So just because the government said it, now it's officially true, right? Wrong. And this is the problem with these powerful men who have nothing better to do than to murder for their own entertainment. Because they're so bored, they don't have anything left to do. It's one thing to defend yourself, it's another thing to trick people into fighting a battle to make you money. And that's what this is about. That's what this is about. I mean, it's sickening. These men would love nothing better than to pull people's strings. People say, what's the purpose of them crashing the American economy? And, you know, I go back to it. They're bored. They have nothing better to do. They would love to take us back to the point where they have us all enslaved and they can kill, torture, and rape at will because they want to go back to the glory days of the Roman Empire. That debauchery from back then. You know, they want to be able to legally be able to own somebody and treat them that way. Because this is the sick kind of individuals that we're talking about. They have a disease, they have a sickness. So yes, they are capable of that, and yes, they will do it. Okay, let's keep reading here. There have been critics of these inquiries. One was, of course, the book written by Colin Simpson, who did the research necessary to write this book in the original minutes of the inquiries. The Los Angeles Times reviewed Mr. Simpson's work and concluded that Lusitania proves beyond the reasonable doubt that the British government connived at the sinking of the passenger ship in order to lure America into World War I. The Germans whose torpedo struck the liner were the unwitting accomplices or victims of a plot probably concocted by Winston Churchill. I kind of disagree with that because there was a lot of people that were complicit. Winston Churchill was not the one who was plotting this by himself. And he wasn't the one who had the most to gain from it, followed the money. And also the Germans, they were being funded by the same people who were plotting this. So I'm quite sure that through those channels, they were being manipulated as well into firing. And whether they were unwitting or willing participants is not the point. The point is that you have to look at the little nuances behind it. Why did they wait until the escort shows up and then leaves again to fire? And my simple answer to that question is photo op. Because if I believe correctly, I'm not sure, I'd have to go back and look, but if I remember correctly, they got both photos of the sinking Lusitania and the U-boat that fired the torpedo. So it provided the Allied powers with the ammunition that they need, the photographic evidence that they needed to rub it in America's face and say, here, we've got the photographic evidence. You know, it was a deliberate manipulation of the media and deliberate manipulation of the players that were involved. So, yeah. I don't think it was just Winston Churchill. You know, they love to target one individual because, like I said before, these men are touted as heroes during these wars, World War I, World War II, when in reality they're just another puppet that's being used by the elite bankers and for their own gain. So you can't just stop the buck at the politicians because they're not the ones who are really in control of the ship. So let's move on to page 2. Behind the scenes, Wilson was secretly plotting America's entry into the war, mainly through the machinations of Wilson's major advisor, Colonel Edward Mandell House. House had already committed America to a participation in the war. The House Gray Memorandum pledged American intervention on the side of the Allies if Germany would not come promptly to the peace table. This agreement was approved by Wilson 8 months before the 1916 election. But the real reason the war was being fought was slowly emerging. One of the first revelations occurred on May 27, 1916, when President Wilson urged the creation of the League of Nations. In a speech entitled League to Enforce Peace, Wilson argued that what the world needed to prevent the recurrence of a similar war was a world government. There you go, folks. They never sleep. They want a one-world government. They want tyranny This is the only way they know. This is the only way that they can control everything and that they can enforce worldwide control and slavery over everybody. Is to disarm people and to have the same rules across the board in every corner of the globe. That is the only way that they know of that they can get their way. They're just a bunch of spoiled brats. They want their way. Well, we're not going to let them have it. Some were not happy with the slowness of America's entry into the war. One of these was Franklin Roosevelt, who, in the early months of 1917, before the official declaration of the war by the United States government, he had been in constant conflict with his chief, Secretary of the Navy, Joseph Daniels, over the same issues. For Daniels, who resisted every move that might carry the United States into the war, those 4 months, January through April of 1917, were the agony of Gethsemane. He opposed convoying the intentional sending of American ships into the war zone in hope that one would be sunk by the German Navy. He opposed the arming of merchant ships, intentionally provoking the German Navy into believing that the ship was a ship of war. Roosevelt favored both. And when a filibuster prevented the congressional authorization of the arming of merchantmen, Roosevelt was impatient with Wilson for not immediately using his executive power to arm the ships. He dined at the Metropolitan Club with a group of Republican war hawks. Roosevelt was a Democrat. It included Theodore Roosevelt, General Wood, J.P. Morgan, and Elihu Root, one of the founders of the Council on Foreign Relations. There you go, people. This is history. This is real. All these terms, I know they sound familiar. And I know that you see the same kind of bait and switch with Roosevelt calling Wilson a traitor to the nation, trying to pin the conspiracy on him. But behind the scenes, he's part and parcel to it. He's dining with the Republicans and he's a Democrat. This just goes to show you that they work together. This two-party system has us by the balls because we believe they are supporting different causes, but they're actually not. They're just using different methods to get the same results, which is our enslavement, incrementally. You know, when are people going to understand that? And they're in cahoots with the people that found the Council on Foreign Relations. They're all pushing for the United Nations, or what was the original United Nations, which was the League of Nations. I mean, come on, it's right there in front of you. The primary topic of the discussion was, according to the Roosevelt Diary, how to make administration steer a dear course to uphold rights. This was a euphemism for an aggressive policy on the high seas that would result in indents and involve the United States in the war. So it's double speak. You can see it just plain as day. Roosevelt's badgering apparently paid off, for on April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, and it was granted on April 6th. The United States was now in the war to end all wars and to make the world safe for democracy. This is the same pattern. Does anybody see that? Really? Seriously? The same pattern. We see it now with them trying to push us into Syria. Does anybody see this? Seriously, this has been going on for 100 years, at least. The war wound its horrible course through the destruction. The war wound its horrible course through the destruction of human lives and ended on November 11th, 1918. Historian Walter Mills wrote the following about the purpose of the war and about House's basic intent. The colonel's sole justification for preparing such a batch of blood for his countrymen was his hope of establishing a new world order, a world government of peace and security. And those are relative terms, because in order to get peace and security, they have to kill many people. They can't be scared of our numbers anymore. I got to stop it for another video. I'll be back.